Morning, everyone, and welcome to Turnstile Tours virtual program for today. I'm Stefan DW, coming to you from Flushing, Queens at the Bowen House. And this is, I believe, our 32nd virtual tour that Turnstile Tours has presented during this time of social distancing. We're excited to have you with us and to talk about my favorite subject, which is the waterfront of New York. Today, we're focusing on the waterfront in South Brooklyn, the Gowanus Canal. We'll be speaking with Brad Vogel, captain of the Gowanus Dredgers, and also president of the executive of the New York Preservation Archive Project. So let's bring in Brad Vogel and we'll talk about the Gowanus. Brad, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. Thank you, Brad. I didn't realize we're getting music. That's fantastic.
Just a little something extra for you today.
Excellent. Put us in a little nautical mood. It's a beautiful backdrop you've got there. A snowier day in the Gowanus than we have today.
Yes.
So welcome. And tell us. I'm as a former resident of the Gowanus. I'm a big fan of this place, and I know there's more to it than what most people know about it. Those who know the Gowanus, of course, think of it as they know that it's a super fun site. They think of it as a place where you might run into the sewage that's coming out of the system after a rainstorm, or oil bubbling up from below, or possibly bodies from some more sordid parts of the past. We can see in the picture behind you a really industrial landscape, but tell us what is the Gowanus and what's your connection to it?
Well, the Gowanus, first and foremost, is my home. And it's my home in part because I really do love the place. Despite all of its malign influences over time, the many things that are wrong with Gowanus, I still find that it's one of the most interesting places in New York City, a place with some of the most layers of history, and a place that, to me and a lot of other people I know in Gowanus, it's just endlessly fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit of that today with you. But why am I here? I'm here mostly because there's all sorts of different ways that I'm involved in Gowanus, and it's given me sort of an interesting perspective on it. Not only am I the captain of the Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club, this group that's out on the water all the time, I also am involved with some of the sort of civic groups and Gowanus landmarking efforts, and all of this has led to a general impression that led my dad at Christmas to give me this little handmade gift that just says Gowanus Canoe Man, was his way of summing it up. So I think we'll run with that. And unless you have any further questions, Stefan, I'll just jump right into the slideshow.
Well, just for continuity for folks who joined us yesterday, we had a great tour about the military history of Prospect Park, and we'll connect with that in a minute, since I know you're going to get us all oriented about, for those, there are people on here who aren't from New York or don't live in New York, and it's good to remind everybody where the Gowanus is. But one way of talking about where the Gowanus is it's down slope from Park Slope. It's down from downhill from Prospect Park, and it connects to military history in Prospect Park as well. But I know we'll get there. But yeah, go ahead and let's see what you have to tell us.
Okay, sounds good.
In fact, I'm going to disappear here and give you the floor.
All right. I, too, am going to disappear, and let's talk a little bit about the Gowanus Canal. So, as Stefan mentioned, the Gowanus is today a neighborhood that is centered on a body of water, an estuary that connects down to the harbor called the Gowanus Canal. It is in what is historically known as South Brooklyn. Today, it is not the southernmost part of Brooklyn, but it is still South Brooklyn. It's an interesting thing to try to explain. But I'm going to run you through a bit of the past of this very interesting place. The Gowanus, as I said, is a place with many layers of history. So let's start out looking back. I guess you could start with the glaciers, really, because a lot of the landscape that you see here on this 1760s map of South Brooklyn, you see a lot of different hills and terrain identified here. So this is sort of the area that's today Carroll Gardens and Cobble Hills. Over
Well,
here.
hang on a second, Brad. So for those of us who don't know that part of Brooklyn intimately, like all I know is New York. Where's Manhattan?
Yeah.
Where's New Jersey? Where are we?
Yeah, sounds good. So let's do this over here. Oh, sorry. I'll draw in a little directional here for you.
Sure.
Manhattan is roughly over there. So the tip of Manhattan would be right up about here.
Got it.
So we are across the East River, and this is the Buttermilk Channel. Here's Governor's Island over here.
That looks a lot different than Governor's Island does today.
Absolutely. So a lot of Governor's Island that we know today was actually fill that was put in later when you'll see on here that it says Nutten Island. So it was originally a much smaller island when the Dutch arrived. But this is the area that we want to be focused on in South Brooklyn. This is what today is Gowanus, highlighted in this pink. At the time, you can see what this really was a valley down between some hills that was a lot of low, marshy, salt marsh ground. And there was what was called Gowanus Creek that went up through into this valley and had all these little rivulets and tributaries feeding into it. And this was really on sort of a glacial outwash plain that was where all the outwash came from the terminal moraine, which is where, when the glaciation ended, it ended along a line here that extended into South Brooklyn. And this is where everything sort of flowed out to the sea from those piles of debris.
Is that Wallabout Bay up at the top right corner where the Navy Yard is?
Yep, the Navy Yard is up here where I'm circling with pink. Named for the Walloons who settled there first.
So that's like downtown Brooklyn in between and Prospect Park down at the bottom right corner?
That is right, yep. So if we take green here, we're looking at downtown Brooklyn sort of roughly in here. And you can see it even says Brookland Parish. But at the time that the Dutch settlers arrived, we're really looking at a landscape that was dominated by, at that time, the Lenape Indians, the Native American peoples that lived in this area, and specifically the Canarsie tribes. And where does the name Gowanus come from? It is a little bit of an odd word, but it's a very old word as names go in New York City. And down here, and I'm going to highlight this with yellow, down here, we're really looking down at the mouth of the Gowanus, because I think a lot of people think that the name comes from up here, what we think of as Gowanus today, but it really came from a leader of one of the tribes of the Canarsie who was Gowan or Gowanus or some variant of that name. And he lived with his encampment in the hills near what is today Greenwood Cemetery, overlooking what is today Gowanus Bay. And so the creek and what later became the canal and the neighborhood are really all named for the fact that as you approached Gowanus Bay, you could see Gowan's encampment, and he sort of guarded the gate to this realm between the hills. There's another historian out there, Joseph Alexiou, who has done some work and says that it's possible that the name is also a corrupted variant of the name, the Dutch word for bay, but the general consensus seems to tie back to this Native American heritage. But in the 1600s already, we have an agricultural realm emerging in the Gowanus, in this lowlands and in the hills surrounding it. So you have peach orchards, you have grain being grown. These are all Dutch settlements. Some of these farms and settlements do actually have enslaved people working on the property, which is important to note. But one of the things I want to focus on is the fact that already in the 1600s, you have vessels that are moving goods from Brooklyn across, through some cutouts across what is today Red Hook, over to Manhattan and getting goods to market. So very early, there's already a connection between Gowanus and Manhattan and the city of New York, what becomes the city of New York, the unified city, 1898 onward. But does anyone know what this little building is right here that I'm pointing at and that I will circle?
We do have Sandra, if you want to ask your question in chat, we'll be able to see it there. So I see you've got a question over on the other side, but just enter that in the chat and we'll get it out there. Enter, yeah, we've got Judy says, is it a grist mill?
It very well could be. It is certainly a tide mill. And you're right that many of the early tide mills were used to grind grain, and so would be a grist mill. However, as we'll see as we move along here, let's go to the next stop. So here are some tide mills. This is what is known as Freak's Mill. This was on the sort of upper part of the Gowanus. And the way this works, I'll just try to explain it for people because there really aren't very many working tide mills left in existence today, but these were really a dominant part of early Gowanus. And it's an interesting mix of sort of rural agrarian society and the beginnings of industry, or what would become a broader industrial revolution. So at high tide, you open up your sluice gate right here. And what happens? The high tide from the sea and from the harbor comes into the pond that you've built. And so you have this mill dam here, and it comes in, and then when at high tide, you shut the gate. You shut your sluice gate. Now out here, the tide goes down. And so you're left with a situation where you have high water over here behind your mill pond and low water down in the main channel. What does that do? That gives you a differential or a head of water. So on a river, that's just a thing that naturally exists because of terrain and topography. Here, man has artificially created the differential. So what you do once you have that differential is you open the sluice gate and the water goes through the sluice, hits the wheel, turns the wheel, and falls down to the lower elevation in the channel. And in the meantime, that wheel is turning a bunch of gears, and you can use that to grind grain. Or in the case of Red Hook, you can use that to grind, and I'll point that out here with pink. You can do ginger as well and make a drink that my friend Gary, a fellow Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club member who's on
Gary's out there, yeah. He's
on
Gary's
the Zoom today. Gary has actually made a version of the drink that the Dutch settlers would make with ground ginger, which is called Jake. So if you're ever looking for a special treat for a party, let Gary know, because it was quite good one very cold night at the boathouse when we were actually doing a program on the history of tide mills, very appropriately.
I have to tell you, Brent, this map is incredible. And what are I'm seeing, it looks like the original shoreline in light blue.
Right.
Not the original shoreline, the current shoreline.
Right.
In blue. The street grid seems to be on this. We see different kinds of vegetation, different topography. Is the orange in the upper right-hand corner, is that military installations?
That's correct. Those are redoubts and other military fortifications that were built. So here's what we're looking at. This is from the mind of another Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club member, the cartographer, historian, and general sort of man of all things, Ayman Deagle. And yes, you're seeing superimposed layers of things, topography, the modern street grid. Here are some things to take away from this. Remember, this is starting with 1766, so this is prior to the Revolutionary War. The coastline looks much, much different. A lot of this is low sort of salt marshes along the coast that later get filled in. Here is the Atlantic Basin where the Mary Whalen port side is located today. Down here you can see, here's the Gowanus Creek coming in, and I'm going to write on this with pink. Comes in from Gowanus Bay and Harbor, twists around, but you can also see, and I'm going to switch over to, let's go to red. You can also see faintly where the channel of what becomes the Gowanus Canal is much more linear and gridded off compared to the wild, unruly creek of the past. But you can also see where the hands are pointing all the different tide mills that were along the shore. And this is not limited just to Brooklyn. We're talking about many, many places around the coast of Staten Island, the shores of Queens, up in Upper Manhattan, the Bronx, all over the city, what is today the city, there are tide mills being used to produce energy and do useful work. And it's something that the Dredgers Canoe Club has actually been looking at, trying to find a way to do a small pilot to show people that we do have this renewable energy resource right at our very doorstep all over. And we actually have a historical precedent for using that power, that alternative green energy.
This is just remarkable, and how much of Gowanus and Carroll Gardens used to be water. And I love how this map makes so clearly there's Cobble Hill. You can really see it was quite a hill in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And so the hill where George Washington, and I'm getting a little bit ahead myself, but let's move right along here. The hill where George Washington himself stood and watched what was the Battle of Long Island, or as we prefer to call it, the Battle of Brooklyn, unfolded in August of 1776. That site, the hill was later leveled, but today if you go to the Cobble Hill Trader Joe's at Atlantic and Court, that was basically where George Washington was standing as he surveyed the battle scene and lamented the loss of hundreds of American soldiers in what was one of the largest battles of the war.
Yeah, tell us more about that. And we made some reference to that with Prospect Park and the military history. What happened with that?
So this is again early in the war. You remember 1776, July 4th, the Declaration of Independence. So we're only, a month beyond that, month and a half beyond that, in late August. And the British, having originally landed on Staten Island, move thousands of troops across to the southernmost parts of Brooklyn. And those troops move up Brooklyn through places like Greenwood Cemetery today, Battle Hill. So there's skirmishes there. There's skirmishes in a watermelon patch in what today is Greenwood Heights near a tavern. And then over in Prospect Park at Battle Pass and the Dongan Oak. So the British are sort of sweeping up at all these different passes. And ultimately, of course, if you read the history, you know that it's Jamaica Pass that they ultimately use as sort of the sneak flanking aspect in this battle. This is not a comprehensive history of this battle by any means. There are numerous books, and I also recommend you check out the Old Stone House, which is a great museum that explains a bit more about this in detail. But suffice it to say, the Old Stone House itself, built in 1699, is really the crux of this battle, and you can see a little vignette of it here. This was one of the Dutch farmhouses near the Gowanus Canal, and the British hole up in this under Lord Cornwallis. The American troops, especially a contingent of Marylanders, along with a few Delaware soldiers, essentially make a series of repeated suicide charges against this very fortified position, taking heavy, heavy losses. And in doing so, they allow the other Americans who are now being overrun on all fronts by a much larger British force, allows them to escape back across the Gowanus Canal, which at the time is really a Gowanus Creek with marshes. So it's a very boggy, soggy place to try to get across, to get up onto the heights and rejoin Washington. So many soldiers die as they're trying to make their way across the Gowanus marshes. And ultimately, those Maryland soldiers have been immortalized as the Maryland 400. And if you really trace things, there are so many points at which the American Revolution is hanging by a thread, and this is one of them. if these soldiers had not charged this fixed position repeatedly at great loss themselves, it is unclear whether Washington and the ragtag band would have lived to fight another day. And as you may know, they escape under cover of fog across the East River in the nick of time to live to fight another day. So all of this battlefield is essentially right on Gowanus. So the neighborhood today and the canal itself are right in the middle of everything. And there's even one poem by Walt Whitman, which is the only time he actually uses the word Gowanus in his entire gigantic corpus of poetry. He is talking about this battle and how the soldiers jauntily stepped towards Gowanus's waters. Stefan, do we have any questions before I go on?
Nothing new that I've noticed, but I'm looking at this map you just brought up. Oh wait, we got a question here. Did the tide mills run in sort of a reverse direction when the tide was rising? So they tended to operate when the tide went out, and when you had the low tide outside and the water penned up inside, you would release the water at low tide or as the tide was going out to take advantage of that differential. Did they also operate with the rising tide?
Yes, to my knowledge, they did. I cannot personally confirm, of course, that the ones in Gowanus did that, but the general understanding with these was they could run for about 6 hours in either direction. They had slack periods where there was no tidal differential to work with, but otherwise they were capable of running in six-hour increments either way.
And so you get around here we have 2 high tides a day. So that's quite a lot of work, but because the time of high tide changes, the time that you're working, the time that you're running the mill changes every day.
Right. Yeah, and the other interesting thing is, especially as the city becomes more conscious of its heritage with oysters, the interesting thing about these mill ponds, the tidal mill ponds, was that they also made wonderful habitat for oysters. And so you had sort of double duty, and there was a gentleman named Jasper Dankerts who visited Gowanus in the late 1600s, who talks about having a meal of venison, peaches, and roasted oysters that were as big as dinner plates from the Gowanus Canal, and that he found quite tasty. So there is, despite all of the many layers of muck and pollution that have come to define the Gowanus in modern times, there's a history of oysters in this waterway.
Well, that's incredible. We're now a little over halfway through, but we haven't even built the canal yet. And yet I'm looking at this map and I don't really recognize what I'm looking at. There are channels that I don't recognize. Where are we?
Yeah, so let's orient ourselves. So I've got the blue pen out here. If you follow this arrow, you would be going down the canal out to the harbor. This little thing here is the 11th Street turning basin today. And here we have the 7th Street turning basin, the 6th Street turning basin. This is the 4th.
So that's Whole Foods right there.
This is the Whole Foods, yeah. This is the 5th Street turning basin. This is totally filled in today, and not many people even know that it once was a waterway. And this one right here is the 1st Street turning basin, which is also, and it's very close to the Carroll Street Bridge. It too is filled in, and it's slated to get excavated by the EPA within the next year.
Wow.
But this, so here we're looking at the top of the canal. This is the beloved and historic Carroll Street Bridge right here. That's a city landmark. This is the Union Street Bridge that a lot of people like to take pictures on for weddings and the like.
Big Beach is right there, the popular barbecue spot.
Yep. Right. So, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, because first we have to go from the Revolutionary War up to the fact by the 1840s, Brooklyn is burgeoning. It is growing rapidly, and the city as a whole and Brooklyn at the time is its own city, separate from New York City. But there are all sorts of different development and industrial schemes underway. So in the 1840s, you get some of the first legislation seeking to make the Gowanus Creek into a more rigidly defined and useful and industrial place. And so you start to see some of the, what I call canalization of the waterway to make it more useful for maritime traffic and industry. These things are called turning basins. This little guy, the 11th Street, is what a turning basin is. It's a place where a barge or a boat can sort of do a wide turn and avoid collisions with other vessels and turn around in the waterway. These long ones are also called turning basins, but really they were more about real estate because they were way longer than you needed for a vessel to turn around. It was mostly about providing additional area of waterfront so you could pack more businesses and manufacturing entities around the waterway and still transport materials in and out. So what did that actually look like? This is a little bit blurry picture, but it gives you an idea. These are wooden crib sort of pilings, mortised and tenoned together, and this is what was used to hold back rubble and define the edges of this new canal. Most of the canal work that actually created a canal out of the wetlands was done in the 1860s. By 1870, you have essentially the modern layout and configuration of the canal. Now, the interesting thing with the Gowanus is, as we'll find out, it became so polluted for so long that the usual marine borer, teredo worms and the like, could not actually survive in the canal, and so they did not eat the wood like they would have in any other maritime environment. So today, when we canoe on the canal and we see these ancient wooden timbers along the canal, we're actually seeing exceedingly long-lived wood for a maritime environment, like sort of crazily preserved wood in modern times. Unfortunately, a lot of that is now being replaced as part of the cleanup process, but I'll get to that more later.
But it has to be replaced, right? Because the only reason it's there is that the water was too polluted for the shipworms to eat the wood.
Right, but it's not being replaced by wood. And so in the sense that, you know, the State Historic Preservation Office has said that these bulkheads are actually contributing elements to, and they're eligible for the National Register of Historic Places based on their sort of engineering history. They're not being replaced in kind. So there's some talks right now about how to offset some of those losses in different ways. But what happens once you have this useful dredged waterway? You have space to build up industry. So you get all sorts of buildings, and this is a little sampling of sort of classic Gowanus brick industrial buildings, but it's not just industry. It's also the things attendant to industry that crop up. So the first here, we have a little tinware company that's making tin boxes and packages. This is what's known in Gowanus as the Bat Cave. And this was actually a power plant to power all of the trolleys that came to define Brooklyn. This is the Flushing Tunnel Pump House. In 1911, the canal was so polluted already that they had to build a flushing tunnel that tried to flush water out of the canal into the harbor by using a giant ship propeller and pumping it out from the head of the canal. Down here, we have the ASPCA building. So this was as horses were used in the Gowanus area, the first sort of animal rights, animal welfare groups started to crop up down in this area. And here we have the Montauk Paint Company. So just another fine example of a building. So industry and manufacturing really comes to define Gowanus, but it also causes really the main problem, which is things get nasty. And at this point, before I go into a further description of the various things that happened to the canal, I thought we would have a little momentary interlude to set the scene. So, we get pollution in the Gowanus, and today people know Gowanus for its toxic nature.
Brian, quick question.
Yes.
The buildings you showed us, those pictures, are those buildings, all of those still standing?
All of those are still standing, and those 5 buildings were all actually designated as landmarks by the Landmarks Commission in October of 2019.
But we've certainly lost buildings in the Gowanus, like the SW Bound warehouse that we talked about in a recent episode. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So there's definitely buildings that have been lost recently, like the coal pockets that once lined the 4th Street Basin. But there's definitely a greater consciousness today, I think, about the value of industrial and manufacturing heritage. But talking about the pollution,
Yes, please.
what you're seeing in this image is something that we see when we're canoeing the canal on the surface on usually on windless days. This is coal tar by and large, which is a byproduct from the manufacturing of gas from coal gasification. And there were three giant plants along the canal. And this is a byproduct that is carcinogenic and goes into the ground and then leaches into the canal and then bubbles up from the bottom of the canal in a process called ebullition, this sort of bubbling and releasing of chemicals from the bottom of the canal. The bottom of the canal, as many of you know, and the dredgers can tell you full well, has about 10 to 12 feet of black mayonnaise. And this is a sort of sludge of industrial waste that is down there. But I want to make clear that when we talk about the pollution of the Gowanus, it's not just that industrial legacy pollution. It's still happening today because we have combined sewer systems in New York where every time there's a rain of even a moderate strength, it overflows the capacity of the pipes to get things that are flushed out of your toilet, your shower, your sink. It overflows, and all of that runs directly untreated into the Gowanus Canal. So every year, the Gowanus suffers over 300,000 gallons of, or actually I think it's 300 million gallons of, sorry about that, gallons of this, what's called CSO, combined sewer overflow. So if you live in Park Slope, Borum Hill, Prospect Heights, Carroll Gardens, Gowanus, anytime it's raining, if you can avoid taking a shower or using water, please do so, because it does directly impact the canal. And I can tell you, we try to avoid canoeing right after a rainstorm, but we get out there every now and then and you see all kinds of things that people have flushed, including the famous Gowanus whitefish. And I will let you Google that and figure out what that is yourself.
And you feel safe canoeing through this tar and sewage and everything?
Yes, I do, because I feel like I have a history of canoeing and a sense of the risks involved. It's a risk that I take as a calculated risk, and I think our club takes a lot of precautions to address the risks. But yeah, I think every individual has to make a decision for themselves about whether they want to go out on the canal and whether they can accept certain risks. And some of that is just based on their ability levels with canoeing and their general feeling of safety or competence on the water. But we have a variety of programs throughout the year, and we have people going out on the canal all the time. So despite its pollution, we are out there. And why do we do it? Why are we out there? The Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club has been around for over 20 years now. And we do it because only by getting people out and interacting on the water with the canal itself can you really build a constituency that can keep pushing for the cleanup of this very polluted waterway. So you have to find a way to love this thing in order to get it cleaned up. And by being out there and by engaging with the waterway directly, we've found that that's what keeps things moving.
And how's that cleanup going? We've got about, this is an exciting picture, but we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And we also had a question, does it smell?
It definitely smells, but mostly at low tide, probably a little more after a rainstorm. And overall, most people who have been around the Gowanus for a good amount of time will tell you that it smells less today, certainly, than it did 10 years ago. The flushing tunnel I talked about was off from the late 60s to 1999. So that's when it really got its nickname, the Lavender Lake, because dyes and dead animal carcasses and the like would just sit there and not move, and it really became pretty nasty and was a very colorful place in exactly the wrong way. That's when it really developed a terrible reputation for stench and the like.
And we
Today,
got a little taste of that between what, November and February,
yes.
before I moved off the Gowanus, the Flushing Tunnel was shut down. And I also, Sandra would like to know, are there walks along the canal? I'm not sure if she means whether like guided tours or places to walk.
Yeah, there are both. There are some esplanades that are starting to emerge that allow people to walk along the canal, and there are some tours. They're put on by Brooklyn Brainery. The Gowanus Dredgers actually has a street art tour that takes you along. So there are definitely periodic tours that crop up.
Great.
So in this picture, I just wanted to point out the fact that the Gowanus was very heavily trafficked. We had tugs, we had barges, we had all manner of vessels really up until about World War II, and then things took a precipitous decline. I just also wanted to point out very quickly, we were talking about the coal gasification plants that cause the coal tar. This, in the background, is an example of one of those. Here
That
we're
appears
looking,
to be a coal barge there behind the tugboat coming
right,
through the 9th Street Bridge there, underneath
right.
the F and G train.
Right, yep, so this is the Culver Viaduct that goes over. So you can tell that this picture is from after some point in the 30s because that viaduct was not built until then.
But before the Gowanus Expressway.
Correct. So what we have here is just a sense of the canal starting to fall into decline. Far less traffic on the waterway. This is the Carroll Street Bridge here that I mentioned earlier, which is a landmark, and it's one of the only retractile style bridges left in the world. And it's weird because what it does is it retracts back on rails at a diagonal from the canal. Really interesting, very unusual. Personally, for me, a beloved bridge from 1889 that is still doing service. And I think one of the defining things at the heart of the canal. So
And
anyway,
I have video of that opening. I'll try to get that posted on the website. So.
great. So it is fun to watch. So the neighborhood falls into harder times. You have sort of a lot of mafia influence going on in the neighborhood, prostitution. It is a hard knock place in many ways, as containerization and highways start to have their toll. But eventually, things begin to change, and you have people engaging civically with the canal. So this is yours truly out canoeing on the canal in one of our classic Gowanus Dredgers red canoes. And the Dredgers were one of the first community civic organizations in the neighborhood to really start engaging with the waterway and looking at visions for the future. And a lot of people in those early years could not see it and thought, these people are totally crazy. But
I will tell you, some people still think you're crazy. I talk to people all the time.
Yes. Well, you've got to go out on a bit of a limb if you're going to envision a future. So in this picture we have right here, this gentleman is, oops, my bad. This is someone who's been part of the club for a long time and really has become a backbone of the club. Owen Foote, who's our treasurer and our current commodore of the Gowanus Boathouse. There's me. Here's people out canoeing. We have public canoeing on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And here's people learning about the canal, learning about the ecological issues and the changes coming down the pike.
How much does it cost to go out in a canoe with the Dredgers?
It is free. You don't even have to be a member. You can just walk up during those open hours and get a canoe, sign the waiver.
The waiver, very important.
Sign that waiver, get your PDF on, which is mandatory, and you can go out.
Your PDF?
Yep, your PDF, your personal flotation device.
There it is.
PFD, yes, sorry. Yes, you can also put on a JPEG if you like. Anyway, the Dredgers, though, like a number of other organizations, we have a lot of groups like the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, Arts Gowanus. There's this sort of breathing of life as the artists found life in the ruins of Gowanus, so to speak, in the 90s and aughts. The civic groups then sort of came along, and the nonprofits came in after that and really started to try to find creative ways to breathe life back into this waterway. And this is one example of the many, many programs that we do. This is a dawn reading of Walt Whitman's poetry as part of the Brooklyn Book Festival. And you can even see Stefan over here in the hat. Oops, I did it again. Let's get him in magenta. There's Stefan. There's yours truly. And we've got a whole host of people from Brownstoner, performers, you name it, out here, bringing people to the water's edge and becoming more aware of how this waterway interacts with their lives and with the city and their community. We also do kind of fun things like paddle in movies, which we just started this past summer. So we had about a dozen canoes rather, full of people lining the 11th Street Basin, and we projected a movie onto the wall. We watched Repo Man. Actually, our first one was Creature from the Black Lagoon. Both of them were fun. We even had a snack barge that went around and sold snacks. So it's about trying to find creative ways to not just see a forlorn place as a forlorn place, but as a place of possibility.
Well, you said Creature from the Black Lagoon. When you've been talking about cleanup, are there animals in the Gowanus? What's life like that's not human?
Yes. So the Superfund cleanup was designated a Superfund site in 2010 by the EPA, and there's the polluting entities, which are known as PRPs, the potentially responsible parties. They actually hire all the contractors to do the work. This is the pilot program where they tested out the dredging of the black mayonnaise right off of Whole Foods in the 4th Street turning basin. And they learned lessons about what to do, what not to do, and they will now apply that as they go about cleaning up the entire canal starting in September of this year. It's going to take a decade at least, though, to get the whole canal fully dredged and cleaned up.
Wow.
But that's why we're called the Gowanus Dredgers. We put in our name what we wanted to happen, which was the dredging of the toxic sludge from the canal. So we're excited to see that. But why are we doing that? And this is, there's brownfields going on land in some of these old coal gasification sites as well. That's important to note. And remember how I said that the coal tar could actually leak and leach out from the land into the waterway? Well, now there are also multiple sites where they're building these giant cutoff walls. These are not walls just to hold up the edge. They also actually stop the movement of liquids into the canal. So the theory is that they will stop these plumes of coal tar from going into the waterway. But why are we doing this? What is the point of cleaning this up? Shouldn't we just leave it there?
Sorry, do you know what happens to the dredged materials, to that toxic stuff they're pulling out of there?
Yep, it gets mixed with concrete to stabilize it because it's very volatile stuff. It then gets put on a barge, shipped over to New Jersey, and then by train it goes to Pennsylvania and is used as layer dividers in landfills.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mentor, for that question.
Yep.
And Lee says that Lee has done a tour canoeing and was not an experienced canoeist and highly recommends it.
Okay, good to know. I'm glad to hear that. And then this is really the reason that we're doing this, not only for humans who might be out canoeing or might happen to fall into the water or what have you, but really for the wildlife that continues to use the canal irrespective of how polluted it is. And sometimes it is a little bit heartbreaking to see animals eating things from the canal or just being in the muck or the sediment that is highly, highly polluted with PCBs and coal tar and all manner of things. And
So
raw sewage.
For people to eat fish out of the canal?
You should not eat fish out of the canal, but that doesn't mean you can't go fishing, because we certainly have members who go fishing. We have members of the Brooklyn Fishing Club who go fishing, and there are definitely fish in the canal. And how do you know there are fish in the canal, first and foremost? Because there are so many birds that use the canal. We have egrets, we have herons, we have cormorants, we have buffleheads, we have all kinds of different animals, winged animals that tell you there are fish in the water.
Great. We have just a couple of minutes left here,
okay.
But yeah, let's definitely hear about mussels.
Yeah, we have these hardy little creatures. Everyone talks about oysters. Oysters are sexy. What about the unsexy mussels, who are already, they don't have to be brought back into the Gowanus. They are already there. They are doing the job of filtering the water, and they wedge themselves into the crevices in these old mortise and tenon sort of Lincoln log spots of the bulkheads. And they're in there. Sometimes they're covered in a coat of muck, but they are doing work, they are living, they are actually sort of thriving in the canal.
But they're removing those walls and replacing them with the one that separates, that keeps the tar from coming over.
And those, yeah, that sheet piling bulkhead is not conducive to life to the same extent. So that's one thing that we in the Gowanus Canal Conservancy and others, and I know Gary, who's on this Zoom, has been working on, is looking at ways to find niches of habitat that can make sure animals and organisms are still able to use the canal. I've been pitching the need for little sort of feral pockets or wild havens periodically along the canal so that birds still have a place to stop as they make their way up and down the canal to do fishing from. All right, we also have marine mammals. We've had muskrats, we've had all kinds of things. We've had cats that walk in the water, but we also have seals, as you can see over here with this sort of creepy skull-looking thing that's popping up. But you know, the canal has also had all sorts of other creatures historically. There was Sludgy the whale, who unfortunately died. There was a dolphin who died in the canal. Back in the 50s, a shark made its way into the canal and brought hundreds of people down to the water's edge, and the cops came and fired shots at the shark as it swam around. So it's a place that we get an occasional reminder is fully connected to the ocean.
When was the last time a human body was pulled out of the canal?
Just last year. Strangely, they get mentioned, and then there's never follow-up as to what happened with them in the press. And that's a little disconcerting to me, but we continue on nonetheless. And there are also, as I said earlier, lots of fish. This is Gary, who I've been mentioning. Gary's one of our all-star members of the Dredgers. He's out here with a crew. This was actually a fishing expedition that went out from the Dredgers and looking for things like porgy and blackfish and stripers and the like. So there's definitely fish out there. This is down in where Gowanus Canal meets Gowanus Bay, and you can see this giant old Lugane ship, which is basically a floating concrete materials warehouse at Gowanus Bay terminals.
That's great. Now we just have a couple of minutes left. So yeah. Oh, this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, because right now, you know, we have human creatures that are struggling.
Yes, we do.
With our current health crisis and the economic crisis that follows that.
Yep. So during this COVID crisis, the Dredgers have shifted all of our resources to trying to help our local neighborhood business ecosystem, because the small businesses and local businesses in Gowanus have been so helpful and crucial to us over the years in sponsoring our events, providing food, doing all kinds of things to make Gowanus a unique place. And so they are in dire straits right now, and we have been doing everything we possibly can to try to help them. Numerous members have gone out on the canal, as you can see here, with this sign saying help Gowanus local businesses, buy gift certificates. We created a list of all the businesses that are open to try to get people to order from them and buy merchandise or gift cards or what have you. We've also come up with this one's out of order, but we'll talk about this at the end if we can.
No, we're about there, so okay. No time like the present.
Yeah, we've been supporting first responders where we can, and we also went out and even greeted the comfort ship when it arrived in the harbor. So you can see Gary in the back and me in the front waving the flag.
I trust you're not as close as you seem to be.
Right. Yes, it is a bit of an optical illusion. We are not as close as we appear to be in this photo. Let's go back very quickly to extremophiles. This is something for you to check out on your own. There are creatures that live in sulfurous and methane-filled, sort of terribly inhospitable places that are in the Gowanus Canal. In 2015, scientists found members of this set of organisms called archaea, and they are very old unicellular creatures, and they are found not very frequently in New York City, but they are in the Gowanus Canal. Some of them are even seemingly finding ways to break down some of the toxins in the canal. Something for you to take a look at, because it's rather interesting and very fitting for the Gowanus.
That's absolutely remarkable.
And here is some contact info for me.
My day job is actually working for the New York Preservation Archive Project. So we focus on the history of the preservation movement in the city and all of the stories and people and places that go with that. So you're welcome to check out our website because we have all kinds of really interesting oral histories and entries there that are worth checking out. And Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club, our main website here, gowanuscanal.org. You can jump in on our raffles that we have going on to support the local businesses and the local Arts Gowanus nonprofit. And we also have a brand new tip jar that we just started today to try to support a lot of the people who are unemployed, who usually work in fitness and recreation and wellness in the neighborhood. That's sort of what's been trickling in the local economy over the last couple of years, and we're really seeing that hit hard right now. And if you want to follow along on Instagram, Bowery Bird, Gowanus Dredgers, or NIPAP, there's always something going on.
That's great. Thank you. Any final words on the Gowanus for people near and far?
The Gowanus is full of life, even if you don't think it is. Come canoe with us, and you will have a whole new view of what New York City can offer.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate your introduction to this really complex and unusual waterway. And I can't wait for things to open up so that we can get back out there on the water with you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. This has been a real pleasure having you with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future. Take care. Be safe.